The United States Navy's explosive ordnance disposal technicians are the most well-trained and recognizable disposal personnel in the military today. They are trained to render safe any explosive hazard that is conventional, improvised, chemical, biological, or nuclear, anytime, anywhere, on land or at sea. The Navy EOD community is a small one with very proud traditions. Dating back to before the U.S. entered the Second World War, the Navy's ordnance disposal technicians participated in every major American war effort since. Whether they were clearing sea mines in Korean harbors in the 1950s or dismantling IEDs placed by terrorists in Afghanistan, Navy EOD is always ready to answer the call. But how did it all start? Who were the first people bold enough to start defusing bombs and mines in the first place? Draper Kauffman was a 1933 graduate of the United States Naval Academy. But on account of his poor eyesight, he was denied entry into the Navy. Kauffman did still take to the seas, though. After failing to receive his commission, he began working for a U.S. overseas shipping company. But only a few years later, Kauffman would see the trend Europe was going towards. Adolf Hitler and his gang of Nazis had Europe teetering on the brink of an all-out war. On September 1st, 1939, tensions came to full tilt as the German Wehrmacht invaded Poland. World War II had officially begun. Kauffman, the son of a career Navy man, wasn't one to shy away from action, and he still wanted to do his part despite America's neutrality. In May 1940, Kauffman would volunteer as a driver for the American Volunteer Ambulance Corps in France. His trip overseas would not go nearly as planned, and he would set the stage for the rest of his future career. Before Kauffman arrived in Europe, his British cousins were already knee-deep in the war effort. Germany declared war on Britain on September 3, 1939, and they wasted no time. In the build-up to this war effort, Germany had new machines developed to inflict death and destruction upon any of their enemies. One such device was the sea mine that was dropped by airplane and functioned with revolutionary new firing systems. This was the German magnetic mine. In November 1939, British Royal Navy sailors of the Department of Torpedoes and Mines were dispatched to the coast near Shorebreeze, England. After the tide receded, a strange-looking item was left behind. Lieutenant Commander John Overy would successfully render safe the first German magnetic mine, and thus begin unraveling the Nazi scientists' new, advanced anti-shipping technology. This was already posing a major threat and garnering up casualties on the British coast. What made the magnetic mine so devastating was that it functioned like nothing else before. Early sea mines would function by coming into physical contact with the ship, and were easy to avoid if they could be spotted. Only a few feet below the water, they posed very little threat if they could be spotted ahead of time, but the magnetic mine would lie still on the bottom, waiting for its target to come over the top. A magnetic firing system would function by waiting for an increase in magnetic signature brought upon by a ship. This revolution in weapons technology would spark a cat-and-mouse game between the Allied servicemen and the German weapons designers themselves. You see, the problem with a bombing campaign on those being attacked isn't just the initial onslaught of ordnance falling from the sky and exploding, but it's the ones that don't explode that can be just as devastating, if not more. In the early days of the German air campaign against the British, the bombs that didn't explode would dig themselves 10 to 30 feet into the ground, and they would just stay there. With Britain gearing up for a total war, there wasn't reason or time to clear up a few dudded bombs stuck in the ground. That all began to change with the introduction of Germany's new long-delay fuses to their arsenal. While most bomb fuses arm in the air and are ready to detonate when making impact with the ground, the new number 17 fuse series did the opposite. The number 17 family was designed to be armed only after making contact with the ground, and starting an internal clock that was preset before departure by the ground personnel loading the bombs onto the aircraft. The number 17 came in electrical and mechanical clockwork types and could be set to a delay of nearly 80 hours. This new firing mechanism was designed to incapacitate British civilians even if planes weren't flying overhead and air raid sirens weren't sounding. Just as the Department of Mines and Torpedoes were doing with sailors in response to sea mines, the Brits met this new challenge by creating a specialized part of the Royal Engineers whose sole job was ensuring the safe disposition of unexploded bombs, or UXBs. As the Brits would learn a way to safely render a bomb or mine safe, word of this would trickle its way back to the Nazi engineers, and they would install a new way to counter the Brits' progress. Tommies and Jerrys would battle each other not face to face, but deepened mine shafts tunneled down to UXBs, man against machine. The German intent was to take as many lives as possible, whether their bombs initially exploded or not. The men who answered the call to protect the lives of civilians caught in the crossfire would always figure out a new and inventive way to counteract the latest and greatest in German fuse technology. The way they learned it was not always cheap. The price of new information often came in the form of a few lost fingers, some singed hair, blown out eardrums, or the highest, human life. One of the greatest cat and mouse games of the Second World War was being played out in English cities and the coastline. While the bulk of the weight of a bomb or mine was the main charge of the explosive, which would range from 50 kilograms up to thousands of kilograms, the real problem is the fuse. The fuse, while holding the smallest portion of explosives, was the key to the entire operation. Depending on its design, the fuse's internal mechanism would start the chain reaction of striking a small but sensitive explosive charge, usually called a primer or a detonator. From there, the boosting, or the gain, as it was referred to by the early disposalmen, which had a larger quantity of semi-sensitive explosives that would bridge the gap between fuse and main charge of the bomb or mine. The new mine disposal units already had their hands full with the magnetic sea mine. As the Blitz increased in intensity, the Army Royal Engineers began their fight against German new fuses. A typical unit consisted of one officer and an assortment of enlisted men. The enlisted men were tasked with the back-breaking job of carefully digging around the UXB, shoring up the sides to prevent cave-in, preparing the tools, and providing additional assistance to the officer. It was the officer's job to be the one doing the defusing. As stated before, the number 17 family of fuses were what led to major changes in bomb disposal work. The Germans implanted markings and numbers on their fuses for their own identification by their own ordnance handlers. That way, if they encountered their own fusing from a crashed plane, they knew what to do. So why not just unscrew the fuse and remove it from the bomb? The ZUS-40 anti-removal device was added to the underside of the number 17s to prevent exactly that. The 40 would be deeper in the fuse well, attached to the booster of the upper fuse. The ZUS-40 would arm once impact was made with the ground, and if the main fuse was withdrawn just over a half an inch, the striker would spring forward, hitting the detonator, igniting the booster, and exploding the main charge. It was impossible to tell if the ZUS-40 was installed below the upper fuse well, and it always had to be assumed that they were present. This prompted the utmost caution to be exercised by the Royal Engineers. Realizing that the actual ticking time bombs were booby-trapped, the engineers soon began hastily removing the bombs with number 17 fuses, loading them on the trucks, and getting them to bomb cemeteries as fast as they could. The bomb cemeteries were isolated away from the town, where the possibly booby-trapped ticking time bombs could tick down away from the civilian populace. Unfortunately, not all trucks bound for the bomb cemeteries made it in time. One of the attributes of bomb and mine disposalmen of yesteryear, and today alike, is their ability to problem solve. Unorthodox problems require very unique solutions. As the deadly game of trying to outsmart the German ordnance designers played out, many new and strange-sounding ideas were fielded, and a few did the trick. In the case of the number 17 long delay fuse, a powerful electromagnet was placed on it to render it safe. The number 17 worked on a system of internal ticking gears that operated its clockwork mechanisms. Once introduced to the powerful magnet, these gears would then jam up, stopping the ticking bomb in its tracks. This allowed for the engineers to haul it off to be blown up, no need even to remove the fuse. But this dynamic battle was just tit for tat. Just as the Brits thought they were getting ahead, Jerry struck back even harder. The next fuses to enter the mix were the new anti-disturbance fuses. The most vicious of these was the EL-AZ-25B, or simply the Y fuse. The Y fuse was located in the center fuse well of the bomb and would only arm after hitting the ground, and had 4 different anti-movement features to function it. Mercury lay in a vial, and if given just the slightest tilt, the mercury would complete the electrical circuit, sending current to the firing mechanism, starting the explosive chain reaction from fuse to main charge. To counter this, another outside-of-the-box technique was used. The Y fuse relied on dry cell batteries to send electricity to the firing system. To drain down the power to zero, the fuse head was frozen in liquid oxygen to lower the battery voltage to zero, and the fuse would be forcibly extracted, safely and from a distance. The engineers were learning on the fly, and they were learning fast. Their unique methodology was proving efficient and effective. The mine disposal crews were going through their own trials by fire on the muddy beaches of coastal England. Two new characters would be introduced into this theater of war. One was a German sea mine finding itself very far from the water, and an American with poor eyesight. In May of 1940, Draper Kauffman arrived in England to lend his hand at helping the war effort. The Wehrmacht was routing French forces at the time, and he was to serve in the capacity of an ambulance driver. Shortly after his arrival, he was captured by the Germans, and he was sent to a prison camp for holding. But on account that Germany was not at war with America yet, Kauffman was shortly thereafter released on account of his nationality. Well, after one capture and release, most people would hang it up and call it a day. But that's not who Draper Kauffman was. After his brief stint as a prisoner, Draper Kauffman was even more anti-Nazi, and he set his sights on a commission in the Royal Navy. After a couple of handshake deals and peeling potatoes as payment for his roundabout voyage of 43 days on a commercial liner from France to England, Draper Kauffman landed in England in September of 1940. A Captain Alan Kirk, then serving as the naval attaché in London, was friends with Draper's father and was able to speak on behalf of Kauffman's character. Soon after, Draper was accepted into the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve. Draper Kauffman was the only American, or Yank, serving in the Royal Navy at the time. It would turn out the month he arrived coincided with Hitler's affirmation to begin pounding London with day and night bombing. No one was safe, not even the royal family, who narrowly escaped a bomb that landed right in Buckingham Palace. Draper Kauffman was eager to serve in any capacity he could, but he feared he would be stuck with a desk job given his poor eyesight. As fate would have it, a circumstance would present itself that would guarantee he wouldn't languish away at a desk forever. While at the officer training school in Hove, England, a bomb landed right next to the mess hall. A disposal team was called to the scene to clear it out. Unfortunately, the Germans would win this round of explosive roulette. The very next day, the students of Kauffman's class were called to attention as the Royal Engineers asked for volunteers. The ever-empty shoes of the bomb and mine disposal persons were hard to fill, but Draper Kauffman was the man for it. He's often remembered as a wild man, a cowboy who never shied away from anything. What other American was away from their homeland, wearing another country's uniform, fighting in a war that wasn't even his own? He was one of one, unique in his spirit and desire to support whatever he felt wasn't just a European war, but one of righteous versus villainous. Draper Kauffman was a lot of things, but he wasn't crazy. When formed up and asked for volunteers for the bomb disposal units, he didn't pop to, raise his hand and volunteer right away. He actually contemplated it, weighing the pros and cons all morning. At lunchtime, he went back to the officers of the bomb disposal units and he volunteered. He had written to his father beforehand, anticipating the call for volunteers in the disposal units, saying, "Much as I loathe the Germans for what they are doing, if I could be of more use saving property and lives than destroying them, I might feel better about it in the end." As it would turn out, Draper's reluctance to join that morning was exactly what the officers in charge of the unit were looking for. The men who volunteered immediately were deemed as overly zealous. This wasn't an attribute that was wanted of a man required with steady nerves. With only a few weeks of basic bomb disposal training, Subaltern Draper Kauffman of the Royal Navy was called up for his services in Liverpool, England. It would turn out that Liverpool had very little bombs, but several airily dropped sea mines. Arriving in England at the same time, there were 3 American naval officers, Lieutenant Commanders Odell Muddy Waters, Stephen Mo Archer, and J.P. Beetle Roach, who were tasked with observing the mine disposal operations from the Brits. They were in preparation for opening a mine disposal school in the United States. With any and all disposal officers, bomb or mine, they were of high value to the British military, and they could not afford them to sit idle. The Land Incident Section, which was a branch of the DTM that took charge of sea mines dropped inland, was under the command of a Captain Curry of the Royal Navy. Curry was able to get in touch with Kauffman's commander in Liverpool, and he was able to get him temporarily under his own command. While Kauffman was trained in the art of bomb disposal, the basic idea with sea mines was the same. The mine had a fuse and explosive just like the bombs, albeit the mines of the time had a bit more of a complicated firing system. Kauffman would have to learn quick, because Hitler's blitz was waiting for no one. What made the airborne drop mine so devastating is that it packed a much bigger punch than most of the bombs the Luftwaffe was dropping at the time. The mines were attached to a parachute, and they would drift down to the ground, and they wouldn't dig themselves into the ground. The Luftmine B, or the LMB, was the biggest of them. It was over 8 feet long and 2,000 pounds. As the mine was dropped on land, its influence firing system, acoustic or magnetic, would not arm as it did not have sufficient water depth to arm properly. To detonate on land, the ZUS-34 bomb fuse was installed into the mine. The 34 had a delay arm to fire feature, driven by an internal clockwork mechanism. After making contact with the ground, the 34 was designed to detonate after 17 seconds. If the mine was dropped into 15 feet of water or deeper, a compressible xylophone would disengage the clockwork mechanism of the ZUS-34, and the mine would lie still and activate its magnetic or acoustic fuse, waiting for an unlucky ship to pass over it. The ZUS-34 wasn't a perfect mechanism, and it was prone to failure. The internal clockwork mechanisms would either get stuck during the arming function or fail to begin in the first place. The slightest bump could restart the ticking clock, making a terrifying buzzing sound to the man downrange. The first method used to render safe the mine involved a rubber bulb from taxicab horns. The bulb would be fitted over the top of the fuse, and air would be pumped in to increase the pressure, compressing the xylophone, tricking the mine into thinking it was underwater, thus disabling the clockwork and allowing for safer removal of the fuse. The few who pulled this off successfully called themselves hornblowers. But the taxicab horn trick wasn't foolproof. Sometimes it wouldn't fit perfectly and air would leak out of the upper section of the fuse because it wasn't airtight, and that would lead to failure. Soon a more reliable mechanical gag was fielded. This would be installed on the top of the fuse itself, and it would force the xylophone down, disengaging the clockwork function. Around this time is when the Germans were getting wind of the Brits' effort to disable their sea mines, and back-engineer them to make their own technology out of it. To prevent this, German engineers installed various means of booby traps inside the sea mines, specifically designed to detonate when certain parts of the mine are removed. One of these was a small light sensor that would immediately fire the mine if the casing was open and exposed to any daylight. This would force disposal officers and personnel to work at night in total darkness, reaching for screws and tools by feel alone. They were equipped with a hardwired field microphone, narrating every step they made, with detailed notes being taken by their team in the waiting area. They did this to ensure that if the mine would blow them to kingdom come, the next person tasked with disposal of a similar mine would be sure not to make the same mistake. Needless to say, the Luftwaffe parachute mines presented new and dangerous problems to disposal teams. After being shown how to disarm the LMB, Draper was thrown into action quickly. One morning, after a couple of disposal officers died, he inherited their tool sets and their enlisted men that came along with them. One was a petty officer, Martin. Kauffman and Martin were tasked with 8 mine disposal jobs during this unique phase of the Blitz. As Kauffman would be downrange, Martin listened intently to him on the other side of his field mic, praying he would only hear his voice and not the terrifying buzzing of the ZUS-34. While the U.S. did have 3 of their own officers in Britain that I mentioned before, Draper Kauffman was leading his own team, making him the first American to dispose of unexploded ordnance while serving in a specialized unit for it. On a bitterly cold January morning in Holyhead, Wales, Kauffman and Martin were on a mine disposal job near a vital railway track. He positioned Martin on a railway embankment within sprinting distance away from the site of the drop mine. It was just far enough to get some distance from the 17-second explosive buzzer of the ZUS-34. The dreary winter weather did Kauffman no favors, but this was war, and the mine had to be taken care of as soon as possible. With cold hands being numbed by the low temperature, he grabbed his tool sets and stepped off downrange to do battle with the unexploded mine. Upon getting down there, he began his work quickly. While trying to insert the gacking mechanism into the top hole on the fuse, Draper's hand slipped and gently slapped the mine. Not hard, but it was hard enough. Soon it began, the dreaded buzzing no disposalman ever wanted to hear. And with that, he took off running faster than he ever had in his life. When the explosion went off, he only remembered things flying through the air around him, and he covered his head and prayed for the best. Walking away with only minor wounds, he received a bump on the head and slight injuries to his kidneys. He survived the blast, and he was found by Martin knocked unconscious by it. Kauffman's commanding officer would joke that he accomplished a 9-second, 100-yard dash. This world record was induced by a sense of urgency, to which Kauffman thought was a beautifully British way of putting it. Kauffman was given time off for the untimely explosion to rest and recuperate in Oban, Scotland. As the winter weather gave way to the spring of 1941, Kauffman was rested and ready for more disposal work. After a surge in bombing from the Nazis, a new foe entered the list of the unexploded ordnance. Located in Bristol, in almost 30 feet of muddy clay, the disposal teams were unsure if it was a bomb or a mine. Kauffman went to the UXB committee to tell them all that he knew about it. The ordnance was a peculiar piece, featuring no parachute or any visible fuse. It was just a streamline shaped, with a strange top hat, as Kauffman called it, covering its backside. The UXB committee granted him permission to travel back to Bristol and attempt to render it safe, so the experts could back engineer it and add it to the list of known bombs and mines. At this time, Draper was reunited with an old friend who was a few years senior to him at the Naval Academy. It was Lieutenant Commander Mo Archer of the United States Navy. Kauffman and Archer would work approximately 30 feet down in a muddy clay shaft that was dug by their enlisted counterparts. They would be forced to wait until nightfall, taking precaution against the light sensor booby trap that had been found on the interior of other German mines to prevent its dismantling. All of their precaution wouldn't be for nothing. After they had rendered the mine explosively safe, it was shipped back to London, and experts found that there was indeed a light sensor inside of it. Together, Archer and Kauffman had rendered safe the new George mine, which would later be classified as a BM-1000. In June of 1941, Lieutenant Commander Waters had recently returned from his study abroad of English mine disposal officers. The U.S. Navy had already set the ball in motion for opening up their own training plan for mine disposal experts that May. The U.S. couldn't deny the fact that they would have to at least keep up with the threats of their future adversaries, knowing that neutrality couldn't last forever in the growing global conflict. On June 16th, 5 naval officers, 3 Coast Guard officers, 5 Chief Petty Officers, and 9 first and second class petty officers that were all previous graduates of the Mine Warfare School in Yorktown, Virginia, gathered at the Washington Navy Yard in D.C. Upon its opening, the Mine Recovery School, as it was first called, would specialize in training men in the model of the British art of rendering safe mines and disposing of them safely. Lieutenant Commander Waters was the first commanding officer of the school. August 22nd would mark a significant day in U.S. history as the first class of specially trained ordnance disposalmen would graduate from training. This day is recognized as the birth of U.S. Navy EOD and celebrated each year by past and present EOD technicians. In September of that year, Chief Gunner's Mate E.D. Bowie began running the diving section of the Mine Recovery School. All students were to graduate as second-class divers, as it was deemed necessary to have expertise in disposing of ordnance under the sea as well as on shore. All students were to graduate as second-class divers, as it was deemed necessary to have expertise in disposing of ordnance under the sea as well as on shore. The training was realistic and challenging. Small explosive charges were rigged into inert mines and torpedoes. If during a test, a student did something that would have caused an undue explosion in real life, the grading instructor would fire the small charge, driving the point home that small mistakes had large consequences in the disposal world. The school would stay in the Navy Yard until November of 1942, where it was moved to the Naval Receiving Station on the Anacostia River. With the move, the school's name was changed to the Advanced Mine School. The new facilities on the Anacostia offered much more space for classrooms, a museum for inert ordnance, and space to conduct training. In October of 1943, the school's name was changed to the Mine Disposal School, as it is remembered today. The Mine Disposal School would operate for another 2 years, until its closure on October 20th, 1945. In September of 1941, Lieutenant Kauffman was selected for leave back in the United States after some harrowing months abroad, doing bomb and mine disposal on behalf of the British Admiralty. Upon getting home, Draper returned to his parents' house in the D.C. area. One night, some visitors were over at the Kauffman household having some drinks. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his wife Catherine, who were longtime friends of Draper's parents, were there. Admiral Nimitz would soon be selected as the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet. But for now, he was serving as Chief of the Bureau of Personnel, which is the department in charge of sending officers and enlisted men to respective Navy commands around the fleet. As Draper told the Admiral of his exploits across the Atlantic, Nimitz was perplexed as to why he didn't have this in his own Navy. Draper replied to the Admiral that upon every request to join the U.S. Navy, he was told that his eyes were too bad. Nimitz calmly brushed that off as he said they were good enough now, as war was only a few months away. Soon after, Admiral Nimitz wrote a memorandum to the Bureau of Ordnance stating the need to stand up a U.S. bomb disposal program. Draper Kauffman's name was the very top of that list. On November 7th, Draper Kauffman was officially given a commission in the U.S. Naval Reserve and was allowed to transfer honorably from the British Navy on good terms. His immediate task was to stand up a bomb disposal school as soon as possible. After 8 years, the young man who graduated from the Naval Academy amidst the Great Depression was finally given his slot in the Navy. In preparation for standing up his bomb disposal school, Draper selected Means Johnson to be the XO after having a chance encounter with the young ensign before he was to go on a date with Draper's sister. The two junior officers raced against time to put together a school from the ground up. Kauffman was given the rare opportunity to handpick his candidates for the new school. He chose to recruit the future bomb disposalmen from the midshipman pools of the Reserve Officer Training Corps at Northwestern and Columbia universities. In these recruiting trips, he would tell the young men his original motive for joining the bomb disposal squad in England. He would tell them that this job would help save lives rather than taking them. All too soon, the need for bomb disposal school would make itself evidently clear. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes would race off of their carriers' flight decks with bombs and torpedoes strapped under their fuselages. Their target was Pearl Harbor in Oahu, Hawaii. This plane was hatched by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, and he wanted to initially devastate the U.S. Navy's readiness in the Pacific. Needless to say, the Japanese achieved their goals. Over 3,435 U.S. casualties, and the loss or total damage of 188 planes and 11 ships. Not only would battleships need to be uprighted and raised from the bottom of the harbor, but unexploded ordnance was in abundance. Draper Kauffman's school planning would have to wait a few days while he was dispatched to Pearl Harbor. Along with Kauffman were a few personnel from the Mine Disposal Command. They consisted of Lieutenant Stephen Archer, Ensign J.W. Grady, Ensign M.A. Smith, and their enlisted counterparts, Chief Gunner's mates Robert Eigell and Devon Winslow. Their task was to help clean up what would become known as a Day of Infamy. At the time of the initial attack, little to nothing was known about Japanese ordnance. The need to inquire what intelligence they could and to safely return Oahu's military bases to operational status was imperative. After the U.S. declared war on Japan the very next day, the clock was ticking. The Schofield Barracks are situated in the center of Oahu, just south of the Dole Pineapple Plantation. It straddles along the Army's Wheeler Airfield, and it was heavily bombarded on December 7th. It was here just outside of an ammunition dump that a 500-pound Japanese bomb of unknown function lay at rest. The chances of it going off randomly like the German long delay bombs in Britain, or being set off by the slightest touch as the various anti-movement fuses, no one could say. After a quick flight to Hawaii, Lieutenant Kauffman and Chief Devon Winslow, who was on loan from Lieutenant Archer's mine disposal team, set to work to defuse the first Japanese munition of the Second World War by men wearing a U.S. uniform. Lieutenant Draper Kauffman by this point had more experience as an ordnance disposal team leader than anyone in the United States. His time in Britain during the Blitz had led him to this. His country was finally at war. But this wasn't Britain, and the ordnance wasn't German. What tricks would the Japanese have up their sleeve? He proceeded downrange wearing his field microphone to report to Chief Winslow all of his movements. Winslow and his team would wait uprange, carefully listening to Lieutenant Kauffman's news from downrange. It would turn out, thankfully, there was nothing devious in this Japanese bomb. The fuse ended up being completely faulty, having failed to arm. Kauffman later remarked that he could have hit it with a hammer and it wouldn't have gone off. Nonetheless, the threat was unknown and every precaution needed to be taken, not only to save the ammo dump at Schofield, but to gain valuable intelligence on the Japanese ammunition stocks. The bomb was defused and the explosives removed from the case by using steam-powered hoses. From there, the bomb would be christened Sousa Belle and would be shipped back to the Washington Navy Yard. This would serve as the first piece of Japanese ordnance for Kauffman and Johnston's bomb disposal school. After disarming Sousa Belle, Kauffman returned back to D.C., one of the first war heroes of the Second World War for the Americans, and for his actions he would receive the Navy Cross. He had no time to relish in fame. He had a school to open and a program to run. Chief Gunner's Mate Robert Eigell and his team would stay in Pearl Harbor much longer than Kauffman. Eigell graduated in the first mine recovery school class at the Navy Yard, and he would later attend the bomb disposal school. As the British were learning lessons the hard way across the Atlantic, the U.S. took notes. One of the biggest takeaways in the early days of diffusing ordnance was the need to perform tasks previously done by hand, like removing fuses, remotely and from a safe distance. As the USS West Virginia's hull had been patched up from the 6 torpedo strikes she took on December 7th, water was being pumped from her, and Eigell's team was on board, searching for UXO as the water receded. It was there he would find a 1,600-pound armor-piercing bomb with 2 fuses. Chief Eigell would alert the salvage boss, who wasn't exactly happy to hear about a bomb in the newly patched-up battle wagon. If it were to detonate, the West Virginia would have its new patches blown and find herself back in the mud of Pearl Harbor. As always, failure was not an option. Luckily, Eigell and his team had just the tool to disarm the West Virginia's Japanese stowaway. Knowing the need to conduct the operation from a safe distance, Robert Eigell had designed a remotely operated wrench that consisted of a pair of rings fitted around the fuse and a wrench. The wrench could be manipulated back and forth from a safe distance using a series of ropes and pulleys. 4 sets of the wrench were manufactured in the machine shop locally at Pearl Harbor. Eigell would use his new remote wrench to successfully defuse the bomb, and with no damage to the new hull's patches. A variation of Chief Eigell's remote wrench is still in use today by U.S. and other EOD forces across the globe. Over the course of their stay, Archer and Eigell's mine disposal team would aid in the safe disposition of thousands of unexploded U.S. 5-inch anti-aircraft rounds, recover 2 torpedoes from a grounded midget submarine, conduct experimental stripping of 2 Japanese projectiles, and help identify fragments from bombs dropped northwest of Honolulu in the early spring of 1942. These fragments were such a curiosity of renewed Japanese activity in Hawaiian airspace that they were taken directly to Admiral Nimitz, the newly appointed SINCPAC. Archer and Eigell's team would stay in Hawaii until July of 1942. What they gained there was an extraordinary knowledge of Japanese ordnance, which would be valuable in the years to come. Most importantly, these brave men help America's most important naval base get back up and running in the wake of its darkest hour. In January of 1942, Lieutenant Kauffman and Ensign Johnson began instruction for their first class of the Navy's Bomb Disposal School. After scrambling to find a location to teach, the two settled to share locations with their brothers at the mine school at the Washington Navy Yard. The instructor cadre consisted of Kauffman and 3 British officers on loan from Draper's former commanding officer of the bomb disposal unit in Britain. While the Navy Yard is well suited for the needs of Water's mine disposal school, it didn't serve Kauffman and his bomb boys too well. The Navy Yard was on the same base as the Deep Sea Diving School, which every student of the mine disposal school was to simultaneously attend. A major shortcoming for the bomb disposal school at the Yard was the inaccessibility to dig large holes. They needed that to simulate working on buried UXO. Kauffman once said that bomb disposal work was 95% digging and 5% taking care of the bomb. Also on the list of shortfalls was the lack of ordnance to train with. The first class had only one piece of Japanese ordnance, and that was the 500-pounder that Kauffman defused at Fort Schofield, Sousa Belle. Though they lacked an equipment to train with and adequate space to do it, Kauffman didn't let that slow down his inaugural class. The final exam took place over more than 24 hours, that included digging and other physical exercise while conducting bomb disposal problems. The goal of this was to see if men became careless when exhausted and tired. That was something that would be unacceptable for the war to come. Despite these setbacks, the first class of the Bomb Disposal School graduated on March 14, 1942. Knowing that the cramped quarters of the Navy Yard wouldn't be a suitable home for the school, Kauffman sent the men out to scour the D.C. area for one that would be. A few ensigns would settle on the nearly empty campus of American University. The College of American University was struggling to keep its students enrolled in the wake of the Pearl Harbor attacks, with many young men joining the military. The campus would provide housing facilities for the students, larger areas for classroom instruction, and plenty of area to dig holes. The university was just as happy to have them. The paycheck from the War Department would keep the lights on for the struggling university. The Bomb Disposal School would cordon off nearly all of the frat houses. It's quite fitting that the future Brotherhood of Ordnance Disposal was first housed on Fraternity Row. Shortly after moving to American University, the school was in full swing, with classes beginning every 2 weeks. As bomb and mine disposal graduates went from the classroom to the front lines, they sent home diffused ordnance and the knowledge they learned. The ordnance was then picked apart piece by personnel from both schools and the Bureau of Ordnance to gain the deadly secrets hidden inside them. The ordnance stores at both schools would soon be the best in the world. As the theaters of World War II expanded, the disposalmen would send back literal tons of new ordnance to add to the publications lists that was being compiled by the staff. While diffusing of ordnance was the main job for the Navy's new disposal teams, gathering intelligence on new weapons was just as important. Understanding and back engineering enemy and allied munitions was one of the major pushes for the early disposalmen. A new dedicated command was formed by the Bureau of Ordnance to inert, which means to remove all the explosives from the interior and make safe, study, and create publications of enemy ordnance. These were then distributed to aid in the expansion of curriculum for the bomb and mine disposal schools and also the men in the field. In June of 1942, the Explosive Investigation Laboratory, EIL, later changed to the Ordnance Investigation Laboratory, OIL, opened up for operations. The EIL would pioneer the use of X-ray equipment and non-invasively inspecting the insides of fuses and ordnance cases. From June of 1942 to October of 1945, the OIL would inert over 7,000 pieces of enemy ordnance. Some notables were the German V-1 Buzz bomb, the Japanese Baka bomb, which was a rocket-powered, human-operated suicide plane with a 2,600-pound warhead. The research conducted at the OIL gave the two disposal schools the best curriculum possible to prepare graduates for the problems they would face in Europe or the various islands in the Pacific. After graduating from either school, the newly minted Disposaleers were sent to different theaters across the world. Originally, bomb or mine disposal teams were small, two-man outfits that would take charge of various swaths of land shortly after the Marines or soldiers took it. In the early days, many men of the disposal communities found themselves operating with very little supervision or any overhead in their two-man teams. Generals and admirals with just as many stars as the petty officers had chevrons would refer to the Disposaleers for their expertise on how to render safe explosive ordnance so that they could keep planes flying, troops moving, and ships sailing. An officer who's usually a lieutenant or below, and a petty officer were tasked with a large scope of responsibilities such as clearing airfields, harbors, and troop staging areas after contact with the enemy, sometimes in strange and hard-to-reach places. The Disposaleers were not frontline troops like that of the infantry. They would serve as a supporting role in the rear echelon in the newly secured area or on board Navy ships. The rear echelon status didn't exactly mean things were safe, though. In the Pacific especially, after an island or part of one was deemed secure by the generals or admirals, many Japanese holdouts were often found. They would reside in caves or isolated parts of the jungle, fighting their own war for Emperor Hirohito, where surrender was unimaginable. One of the early graduates of the Bomb Disposal School was J. Frank Durham, Aviation Ordnanceman, 2nd class. Durham graduated in class number 4 from the Bomb Disposal School on July 4th, 1942, after 8 weeks of grueling work. Classes in those days were 6 days a week from 08 to 1700. In his memoir, You Only Blow Yourself Up Once, Confessions of a World War II Bomb Disposaleer, Durham recalls that bomb disposal work was just as secret as anything could be. They took an oath not to tell their folks or anyone else what they were doing so as to minimize the risk to those involved. He goes on further to explain that the British had learned earlier in the war that publicity was not the disposalman's friend. It was all too easy for the Germans to get wind of the Royal Engineers or the sailors of the DTM bragging about their achievements and how they outsmarted their German adversaries. After graduation, Durham was sent on board the bomb disposal school staff to help facilitate its move to American University, which took place on July 8th. After a few months on staff and an incidental run-in with Admiral Leahy, the unofficial chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, AO2 J. Frank Durham packed his sea bag with orders to the Pacific. Durham would arrive on Guadalcanal Island in December of 1942. In the previous months, the 1st Marine Division made the island famous. Guadalcanal was the first place the U.S. launched a land-based offensive in the Pacific. The likes of John Basilone and Chesty Puller fought the Japanese tooth and nail for every inch of ground. The Navy fought its own battles off the coast. In multiple engagements with the Imperial Japanese Navy, the U.S. surface ships would blast their big guns to protect the beachhead to keep the flow of men and supplies to the front. One of the major strategic points on Guadalcanal was an airfield located on the northern face of the island's middle section, facing Sea Lark Channel, which would later be known as Iron Bottom Sound, for the number of naval vessels from both sides that would find themselves sunk there. The airfield was named Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who died during the Battle of Midway. With Henderson Field seized, it would serve as an unsinkable aircraft carrier to launch fighters and bombers from. The tactical advantage of Henderson Field was key to the overall success of Guadalcanal and the expansion of the island-hopping campaign as a whole. The Japanese fought like hell to take it back, and the Americans fought harder to keep it. It was at Henderson Field that Durham would join his bomb disposal officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Homer Anderson. The men were positioned there to respond to any ordnance-related issues on the airfield, American or Japanese. The slightest delay in airplane operations could spell ultimate disaster for the troops or ship calling in support from Henderson. One day, while managing the bomb disposal shack, a plane was coming back for landing with an unwanted passenger. A bomb had failed to leave the underside of the plane during its initial run. Durham ran out to the plane, while flight control waved off any others trying to land. Some of these planes could have been critically low on fuel after their far-off target runs and in desperate need of landing. If the bomb were to go off, the pilot would definitely die, the plane lost, and a large hole would require patching up in the runway. None of these things could be afforded, as they would all slow down the movement of troops out in the field. With this in his mind, Durham defused the bomb as fast as possible and released it from the rack. All was back to normal at Henderson thanks to the quick actions of a well-trained disposal expert. Countless small actions like the one done by Frank Durham were just part of daily life for the men of the small unit disposal teams positioned around the globe during the war. While their primary duty station was on the airfield, Durham and Anderson were often called to surrounding islands where their expertise was needed. One night in the nearby Russell Islands, the two were called up to clear a landmine field. Durham would describe these as moments of sheer terror. While trying to deal with the landmine field, American and Japanese artillery were duking it out, and the two men were caught in the crossfire. Durham says shells would pass overhead, hit the earth, and explode. We worked in the dark, knowing we could get killed by the shelling or killed by a mine. Try that someday and see how you feel. Like many supporting jobs to the main battle force, ordnance disposal was often thankless. They fought their own kind of war with the enemy. They would find themselves on freshly shelled or bombed beaches, cleaning up the mess so more men and materiel could be ferried ashore. Deciding which munitions could be moved, or which ones needed rendering safe on the spot, time was definitely of the essence. In some cases, the pace of the war was held in the palms of their sweaty but steady hands. As the war expanded and the need for more concentrated disposal units became evident, the War Department stood up 4 Mobile Explosive Investigation Units, or MEIUs, which are the predecessors of today's EOD mobile units. The purpose of these units was to better coordinate bomb and mine disposal work, the distribution of information of enemy ordnance, and provide salvage divers who were qualified in the use of explosives. While bomb and mine disposalmen attended different schools, they would soon serve arm in arm at the MEIUs. Consisting of many more people than the original 2-man format, these units were still small compared to the others of the time. For example, MEIU-2 left the United States with only 6 people. Often arriving in the area, the MEIU would assume command of the other Navy disposal teams that were there before them. MEIU-1 was based out of Australia and found its niche by maintaining and organizing of reporting intelligence on enemy ordnance. MEIU-1 would participate in every Allied campaign in the Southwest Pacific in 1944. They would move to the Philippine Islands after General MacArthur and the U.S. Third Fleet rooted the Japanese out of them. While at the Cavite Naval Base in the Philippines, MEIU-1 personnel cleared over 600,000 pounds of UXO. Unit 4 began operations relatively late in the war, on June 4, 1944, based in Pearl Harbor. They found themselves clearing UXO after the legendary conquest of the Marianas Islands, all the way to the surrender in Tokyo Bay. Units 2 and 3 would find themselves in the Atlantic Theater of Operations. In the summer of 1943, Unit 2 was formed and set up in the Mediterranean. After landing in northern Africa, the men were shortly moved to the newly liberated city of Palermo in Sicily. While operating in Italy, the men were exposed to new types of Axis ordnance, such as German human torpedoes at the Anzio beachhead, or radio-controlled bombs on the island of Corsica. In preparation for the Allied landings in southwestern France for Operation Dragoon, BM-1 James Woods and EN-2 Thomas Sheridan were dispatched to aid in clearing mines along the beaches. As the Allies established a firm foothold in France after Operation Dragoon and Overlord and the breakout from the Normandy beachhead, the whole of Unit 2 moved to Marseille, France. The port of Marseille was filled to the brim with German mines. The men would don their new buoy recirculating suits, and they took to the water. The buoy suit was designed by the same E.D. Buoy who stood up the diving training program from the mine disposal men in the Navy Yard. The buoy suit was much quieter than the original Mark V diving dress, which was needed for the acoustic sensor precautions, and it also had a low magnetic signature. This made it perfect for diving on the German mines. With their buoy suits on, the men of Unit 2 removed over 173 mines from the port of Marseille. After the majority of the fighting moved inland in December of 1944, and the men of the 101st Airborne hunkered down in their foxholes in the Ardennes forest, Unit 2 had served its purpose to the utmost and was disbanded. The men were either shipped back to the U.S. or went back to their two-man disposal teams. MEIU-3 made its way into England in March of 1944, and it would later come across Utah Beach and Normandy to aid in the massive cleanup operation of German and Allied UXO that clogged the landing area in the wake of the D-Day invasion. While clearing up Utah and Omaha beaches, they also assisted in demining of various ports on the northern French coast. Unit 3 was known for carrying a radium capsule in the front of their Jeep, as they would work to X-ray German UXO in the field to gather intelligence. They even had a portable tent to process photographic film to aid in their reporting. Like the men of Unit 2, 3 moved inland as well. Le Havre was their new home, and from September to November, they would be focused on the perimeter of Paris, ensuring that the roads leading to the city of love and lights were safe as hundreds of thousands funneled into the newly liberated capital of France. Together, the 4 mobile explosive investigation units helped to keep the Allies on the move, ensuring roads and ports were safe for travel. In turn, they helped themselves by collecting information and data on enemy ordnance to report across the battle space, and then to back home. By doing this, the Navy disposal units were able to ensure that they were the most well-versed on their enemy's weapons. They were able to keep up with the evolution of weaponry that was commonplace during World War II. The island of Choiseul is an 1,150 square mile stretch of land that sits 7 degrees south of the equator. It is the largest island and the namesake for the Choiseul province in the Greater Solomon Island archipelago, just south of Bougainville. On many such islands, coast watchers, who were British, Australian, or New Zealanders, who were left behind as the island fell from the British to the Japanese. These coast watchers would use radio equipment to communicate with Allied bases to provide information on the Japanese movements in their area. The information they provided was of much value to the Allied intelligence specialists and helped in the planning of offenses in the area. The native populations on the islands often helped the coast watchers to stay on the move and evade capture. Without them, the flow of intel would never have made it back to the Allied commands in Pearl Harbor and Australia. An American B-24 Liberator crash-landed on Choiseul in 1943 with one of its bombs landing near the village church. The unexploded bomb frightened the natives so much that they nearly vacated the village. They refused to go anywhere near the bomb. Not only was the aircraft and bomb laid to rest, so was the Bombardier's Norden bomb site. The Norden bomb site was the Army Air Force's most prized possession during the World War II aerial campaign. The Norden was an advanced and highly secretive tool for precision bombing. American airmen took great care to render them useless if loss of the aircraft seemed likely. It was a major concern of the War Department that if the Norden were to fall into Axis hands, it would improve their own bombing accuracy, leading to greater devastation on the ground of the Allies. When the Coast Watcher reported this up the chain of command to the Southern Pacific area, Admiral William Bull Halsey was intrigued at the opportunity not only to recover the valuable Norden asset, but to help out a friendly village. Lieutenant Homer Anderson of the Guadalcanal Bomb Disposal Unit and Ensign Wes Watson of MEIU-1 were tasked to fly from Tulagi to Choiseul in a PBY flying boat with 8 fighter aircraft as their escort. Choiseul was the home to a Japanese seaplane base, and the men were deposited on the opposite side of it, and they paddled ashore with all their equipment to do the job. The 2 officers knew that they would be stranded on Choiseul for at least 1 week until the PBY and fighters could come back and get them, which wasn't a guarantee. Under the cover of darkness, they located the Norden bomb site from the downed B-24, and then they proceeded to defuse the bomb. Any misstep in their render safe procedure wouldn't only kill or injure them, but it would alert the Japanese to the intruders on the island. If they survived the blast, Anderson and Watson would surely find themselves at the mercy of the Japanese soldiers, and the natives would face severe punishment for aiding the Americans. Needless to say, it would have to be initial success or total failure. Carefully and at night, the bomb was defused. The hardest part was still ahead of them. Anderson and Watson had to roll the now fuseless bomb to a canoe and then paddle it out to the lagoon. They deep-sixed it and sent it to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. It would be 9 days until the Coast Watcher was alerted that the PBY was coming back to pick up Anderson and Watson. During their stay on Choiseul, the 2 officers passed time with the Aussie Coast Watcher. They were sipping cognac on the beach that Anderson brought from Guadalcanal and watching Japanese planes and ships go by. Undoubtedly, the coordination between a mobile explosive investigation unit and COMSOPAC was key in getting this mission accomplished. Had there not been a larger command structure to coordinate bomb disposal efforts in the area, the bomb would have probably stayed by the church and the villagers would have remained terrified. The operations of this nature weren't an everyday occurrence, but it represents the essence of the Navy disposalman's mission and ethos. The men of the World War II bomb and mine disposal teams were ready to go anywhere their skills were required. Their mission wasn't to bring death and destruction with them. It was quite the opposite. They would go there to prevent it and help people in need. Adolf Hitler would commit suicide on April 30th, 1945, and Germany would formally surrender on May 8th. War in Europe had finally come to an end. But battles were still to be fought in the Pacific, as the Japanese refused to capitulate. With the fall of Okinawa, Allied victory in the Far East seemed imminent. Paul Tibbets and Charles Sweeney flew 2 B-29 Superfortresses from Tinian in the Marianas Island chain to deliver the final nail in the coffin for the Japanese. Big nails as they were, the Little Boy and the Fat Man atomic bombs decimated the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then, and only then, the Second World War drew to a close. Just because the war was over didn't mean the work was done, though. As General Douglas MacArthur oversaw the massive disarmament of Japan, hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops were deployed to the mainland to assist in bringing order to their now former adversary. Before their surrender, the Japanese had been preparing for a full-scale defense against an invasion of their homeland. Untold stocks of weapons and munition laid in storage that had to be disposed of. From the time of the formal surrender ceremonies on board the USS Missouri to July 1946, Mobile Explosive Investigation Unit 4 disposed of an estimated 80,000 tons of munitions. With the war finally won, the massive demobilization of the War Department began to take shape. On October 20th, 1945, the Mine Disposal School on the Anacostia Receiving Station closed its doors for good. 11 days later, the Bomb Disposal School will be shut down at American University. In 1946, the Bomb and Mine Disposal Schools combined their curriculum under the single name of Explosive Ordnance Disposal, thus giving birth to the namesake the community bears today. In May of 1943, Draper Kauffman was called for his explosive expertise in different means. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were already planning a cross-channel invasion from England to France, and Kauffman was tapped as the man to train another unit of explosive experts. Kauffman would train the Naval Combat Demolition Units at Fort Pierce, Florida, to go in with the initial assault waves on D-Day at Omaha and Utah beaches. Later, Kauffman would transition his NCDU school into that of the Underwater Demolition Team, who were the forefathers of today's Navy SEAL teams. Kauffman and his UDT men would serve with distinction in the Pacific Theater throughout the remainder of the war. Kauffman would go on to serve for a total of 32 years in the Navy, and he would retire a Rear Admiral. In 1987, an Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate, FFG 59, was christened USS Kauffman after Draper and his father, Vice Admiral James L. Kauffman. The Naval School for Explosive Ordnance Disposal at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, is where all of the branches of America's military trains its EOD technicians today. The main school building, who was named in honor of Draper Kauffman to commemorate his initial efforts in bomb disposal and his leadership in opening the school in 1942. The likes of Draper Kauffman will probably never be seen again. The man whose eyes were not good enough for a commission in 1933 would never take no for an answer. The two communities that look to him as their founder today, the EOD technicians and SEALs of America's Navy, truly embody the attitude and spirit of America's first Disposaleer and Frogman. As for Robert Eigell, he would fare just fine himself. Chief Eigell's war would take him from the burning wreckage of Pearl Harbor to the surrender ceremonies in Tokyo Bay in 1945. In 1946, he would occupy a cognizant desk for EOD and underwater disposal in the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. While serving as the mine disposal coordinator, he was a key figure in the transition from wartime to peace and the creating of the new EOD school at Indian Head, Maryland. Eigell's naval service would take him around the world as he served in various leadership roles in the new EOD community. After a full 28 years of service, Eigell would retire as a commander. A humble street sign in front of the EOD Technology Division Command at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Indian Head, Maryland, bears the name of Eigell Road in his honor. After the war, most of the men went home, and they took their stories with them. They didn't fly bomber missions over enemy airspace, jump into combat over France and Holland, or trudge through the surf on small Pacific patches in the initial assault waves. The Bomb and Mine Disposaleers War was very different from one of that of their brothers in arms. But the foundation they laid while walking downrange time and time again to do the unthinkable was a different type of heroism all of its own. 21 men never made it back home. Their service and sacrifice to their country was not in vain, and it should be remembered by the American people for the unique capacity in which they gave their lives. Rarely were the men of the bomb and mine disposal communities called to take lives. They were there to save them. Countless servicemen and civilians were made safer in Europe and the Pacific Theater by their devotion to taming the destructive nature of the unexploded munition. The first American disposal technicians are the forefathers of a community that is proud to walk in their shoes or swim in their fins today.